welcome to Irish America Magazine. My name is Tom Deignan. We are pleased today to be joined by novelist as well as historian Peter Quinn. He is here to talk about, among other things, arguably his most famous book, the novel The Banished Children of Eve. It is being re-released, as are all of his other books. That includes a trilogy of detective novels about the sleuth Fintan Dunn, as well as a collection of his nonfiction called Looking for Jimmy. Peter Quinn, thanks for joining us.
Tom, good to see you again. I was just saying before we came on that we know each other 30 years now, I think.
Please do not remind me. Let's talk about this special occasion. The Banished Children of Eve was your first novel.
Right.
You had written this book, I guess it came out in 94, correct?
Yeah.
Peter,
20 years ago.
You brought up the age thing or the time thing, so I guess I'll mention that. I think when that book came out, I'm pretty sure I didn't have an email address, any of that stuff.
Right.
So some time has passed with this book coming out again, and we're going to talk about why this is a great time for this book to come out again. But what was it like for you to revisit this book after some time?
Well, I didn't really, I never reread the book. I haven't. My feeling was that's what I wrote. I stick by the characters, and the characters are like my children. I can't change them out in the world. And it's been great to see them continue to exist and come alive in people's minds. I mean, that's what any writer wants, that the people you create become very real to you. I spent years with them. It took me 10 years to finish the book. And I'm very encouraged to see those characters haven't gone away. They've become part of the landscape.
So for people who may not know, The Banished Children of Eve is set in the 1860s in New York City, and it really is a panoramic book. It really takes you in and out of life at every level of New York City in the 1860s, and it sort of culminates, if you will, in one of the most notorious incidents in American history, but in some ways, one of the most oddly forgotten, what we call the New York City Draft Riots. Peter, can you tell me a little bit? This is a long time ago, and we're a strange country. On the one hand, we're arguing about history left and right, and yet so many people seem to know so little about history. What is sort of the contemporary relevance of a book set in the 1860s about, a horrific spasm of violence in New York City? How does it speak to us today?
Well, the riots kind of bring to life three factors that were driving events in New York City: immigration, urban violence, race, and economics. There was this tremendous gap. Was the age of shoddy and the Gilded Age, and the divisions of the rich and poor were tremendous. The racial divisions in the Civil War were bloody and violent and dangerous, and the city had the greatest wave of immigration in its history. 1 million Irish came across South Street in 1840s and 50s. The city of 600,000. In a sense, there's never been a wave of immigration like that. And the Irish immigrants from the famine were unskilled. They were rural people. In some ways, they're more like boat people than immigrants. And there were no laws against immigrants. And they changed everything in the city, and they caused tremendous divisions and violence. So, nothing's really changed since I wrote the book. In fact, it's gotten worse, it seems to me. And the other thing, on the cover of the book is the burning of the Negro Orphan Asylum, or the Colored Orphan Asylum, which was on 5th Avenue and 43rd Street. It's where the Century Club is. There's no monument to it. On the first day of the riots, mobs attacked that, and there were 200 African-American children there, and the mob was interested in killing them. And I just said to myself, where does this kind of hatred come from? And a lot of those rioters, we know, were Irish. They were only here for 20 years. They'd never seen a Black person before leaving Ireland. And where did this passionate hatred come from? What's the impetus for that? Why is that still part of America? It seemed to me like it's the virus that never goes away, racism. And I thought to myself, they did all these Civil War enactments. People go to Gettysburg, they dress up. The one event that still has the most relevance is the Draft Riots. And it's the one event that has no commemoration. There are no plaques. Nobody's ever tried to reenact it because we don't have to. We're dealing with a lot of the same problems that we were in the 1860s with race and economics. And that's what the Draft Riots were. They weren't just they were a race riot. And African Americans were hunted down and hanged, but they were more than that, because most of the people who died in the riots were the rioters, were Irish and the other people at the bottom, because this wasn't a regular, when people talk about American race riots, they were actually talking about anti-African American pogroms in the 19th century, burning of like the Tulsa, Oklahoma, or in North Carolina. And this wasn't just that. This was an explosion that went up as well as down. In a way, I say it was the one reverberation in the world of the violence of the famine was in New York City. And what no historian ever pointed out before, the riots, the draft in New York started on July 11th. The 12th was a Saturday. The riots started on the 13th, the day after Orangeman's Day. Now, Orangeman's Day doesn't mean much to Americans, but it was the flashpoint in Irish history. And whoever figured out when to start the draft didn't know anything about Irish history.
Yeah, and
This was an old history of oppression. This was like rubbing your face in it. And of course, America had never had a draft of the Civil War. And the way out was if you had $300, you could buy a way out. So this was really a poor man's war.
yeah,
And
and
the things were piled on top of each other. Yeah, go ahead.
well, and for people who may not be familiar with the draft riots and sort of how difficult the sort of that moment in American history was, I mean, that's the amazing thing about your book is that it gets sort of at all that stuff. I mean, when you think about July 1863, Gettysburg, draft riots, draft, which is okay, we're going to have a draft, but if you have $300, which
Right.
by some estimates is like an annual salary by today's
It's
standards,
like
you know,
longshoreman's annual salary.
yeah, you can buy your way out. So there is so much going on. Your book, to its credit, gets to all that, and yet I think one reason it's become so difficult to talk about is because it's so complex. It's so
Right.
difficult to say, well, we should root for these people. It's
Right.
way more complicated than that.
Right. Yeah. And as again, I say, none of it's gone away. In the 27 years since I wrote the book, none of it's gone away. It's become more relevant, I think. We've entered another phase of American history where we thought we had the race problem on its way to solving, with Obama and things, and we don't. We're back in a lot of ways where we've always been, with this tremendous animosity and division and lack of understanding between the races and immigration. I mean, the Irish immigration is really what started the immigration controversy in the United States. There was the largest political party, third party movement in American history was the American Party, or the Know Nothings, which was founded explicitly to stop Irish immigration. By 1855, they controlled every legislature in New England. And there was this move, even there were instances of deporting Irish back to Ireland, emptying poorhouses to get them out. The governor of Massachusetts in 1855 said, we haven't seen anything like this since the barbarian invasion in Roman times. We just forget about the degree of violence and animosity and struggle that went on with this immigration. I mean, you see people coming over the border from Mexico. Well, they were coming by the thousands onto South Street, 1 million people. It was a shock. I always say America had three waves. First, we had settlers. Then we had pioneers. And the controversy about people coming only rose with immigrants. The poor people coming who weren't, and the Irish were sticking together. They weren't leaving. They had this history of, they stuck together because they were perceived if they didn't, they'd be destroyed. And all the things about said immigrants, insularity, they stick together. They don't want to work. I mean, immigration is a tough problem. I'm not trying to simplify it, but it's been a tough problem for a long time. And it didn't start on the border with Texas.
Yeah,
it started in New York City.
I mean, I think that's one of the many things you take away from your look at the draft riots is there is this a significant number of people today who say, you know what, immigrants used to come over here and behave, and now they don't, they don't behave, they don't try and become American and blah blah blah. I mean, listen, again, like you said, say what you will, you can have an opinion about immigration then and now, but that is not true. That is a real simplification of a complicated problem.
Has been the problem since it started. There was Theodore Bingham was the police commissioner in 1905, and he wrote an article in the North American Review about Jews as a natural criminal class. And Italians, they tried to keep Italians out. And again, it's not, immigration is a problem. It's they have to deal with, but it's not something new, and it's not going to be solved by turning people into archetypes of evil.
In case you're joining us, thank you for joining us at Irish American Magazine. I'm Tom Deignan. We're talking to Peter Quinn. He is a novelist and historian. His books are being re-released by Fordham University Press. We're talking about what I would say is the great Irish American novel that we have, The Banished Children of Eve. Peter, you've also written tons about Irish history, Irish American history. Let me just go into your background a little bit. Tell me a little bit about where you grew up and why Irishness, Irish Catholicism. How did all those things become so important to you?
Well, I grew up in the Bronx in the 1950s in the East Bronx, and I knew I was Irish. I knew my grandparents were from Ireland, but I really know anything about Ireland. I mean, my parents weren't reading Joyce and Yeats. I went to parochial schools from kindergarten through graduate study to PhD, which I didn't finish in Bronx parochial schools. I was never in anything but a Bronx parochial school. I never heard my family originally came in the famine. I never heard anything about the famine. In all that time, I never studied anything about Irish history. The one time I studied Irish history was in a course at Manhattan College on Victorian England. And, it was this feeling Irish, but having no sense of what it meant. Irishness to us was the Catholic Church. Everything was around the church. They used to say that, people went to Irish dancing lessons were the kids who couldn't run faster than their parents. And, I left New York City to become an Invista volunteer in Kansas City, teaching as a volunteer for a year. And it was that point I turned around and said, I really don't know anything about where I come from or what my ancestors' experience was. And that started me back to let me find out before I go anywhere else, let me find out about myself. And that set off, a year's examination into my Irish background, what it meant. Only recently, Looking for Jimmy came out as a collection of essays. I got a letter from a woman in Virginia who turned out to be my cousin. We had totally lost touch. Mannings, where my family came over in 1848. And I learned all these things I never knew. My great-grandmother, I told was had 5 children. She had 10. I have 2 great aunts buried in Calvary Cemetery who died at age 1, Catherine and Anastasia Manning. I went past in the Midtown Tunnel. I had no idea of my own history. And I always say the Irish are obsessed with their history. No, they're not. We know so little about our history. It's like a big blank record. In fact, I was told the family that came over were Mannings. Their name was Mangan. That's why nobody could find them. They changed their name when they got here. And parents tended to drop that history because it was unpleasant. I mean, who wants to know that their great-grandfather was on Fifth Avenue firing at the police, right? So that history just dropped away. And my Irishness was my Catholicism. And then I just said, there's so much more to this. And Irish America is not Irish history. It's a different history. It's rooted in events in Ireland, all the attitudes towards the church, towards the civil service, but we're a different people. And we don't write anything about ourselves. When I started to write, I said, I'm going to write this novel. Well, actually, I'm going to write a book about the famine immigration to New York, there was no book about it. And then I went down to the public library and said, let me read the fiction, because Irish people love to write. Here's the defining event in modern Irish history, the famine. I'll go down and read the fiction that they wrote about. I could read it in an hour because there wasn't any. Look, there was 0. I mean, somebody said, oh, you wrote the great book about the famine. I wrote the only book 27 years ago. I said, I think you're trying to compliment me. I don't have any competition.
Right. But that's silence. I mean, to me, that's one of the reasons why there is still such anger around immigration, is when there is that silence and that void. Everyone seems to think they came over on the Mayflower and that it's their country. And here we are.
I never had the story of the pain, the people who were lost. It was only the people who survived that we talked about. It wasn't all the people lost along the way. When the book came out, my mother was 88, Banished Children of Eve, and she was an educated woman. She was a classics major at Mount St. Vincent. And my sister said, you better call mommy. She read the book. And she said, I said, what do you think? She said, well, it's hard to get to this age and realize you have a son with a pornographic imagination. And then she said,
I knew immediately.
She said, we didn't know people like this. We didn't know thieves and prostitutes. I said, we didn't know them, but we come from.
Yeah. Well, that's the other thing, right? It's like, well, my grandfather did this. Look, maybe he did.
Yeah.
Someone else's was doing something else.
Right. And we don't know what a lot of our grandparents and great-grandparents did. Yeah. Because we don't know, the ones who were alcoholics who wound up in poor houses, or the thousands who fell by the wayside and didn't make it, generally don't get on the record. Even, trying to write about my family, 99% of the human race has no there's no history. Well, my relatives were lines and censuses or tombstones, or even without tombstones and cemetery records. And I wanted to dig those people up. And then I realized this is one of the things I wrote a novel, because I said, I can't find them in history. They don't exist. I don't know their voices. I don't have a picture of my great grandmother, Margaret Manning, who came from Ireland. I don't have rosary beads. I don't have a bureau. I don't have any artifacts. I have her name. And I know where she died in 1912 on 7th Street and was buried from St. Bridget's. That's pretty much it. And now I know she lost 5 children. I mean, how does a woman deal with the loss of 5 children and not become part of you? If you go to the Tenement Museum, there's a top apartment of the Carmody family, and they had 9 children, 2 of whom survived to adulthood.
Yeah.
And they tracked down the family, and they had no knowledge of this. None.
What, in your opinion, when you have a silence like that? What, in your opinion, is the consequence? What's happened to us because of that, or how has America been hurt by that?
Yeah, I think what you were saying before, you lack all sense of dimension. You lack sense of, history it doesn't repeat itself exactly, but a lot of the themes go on. And you don't realize there's a continuity here. It's like we live in this new age where this never happened before. People have never done this. This cancel culture thing, I have to laugh sometimes because they, destroying monuments. Well, I'm Irish. We destroyed a lot of British monuments. They blew up Lord Nelson's pillar. When I was at the University College Galway, buried in the back was the lion and the unicorn monument to Queen Victoria. They pulled it down. They changed the names back to Cove and Kings to Kings County and Queen. They canceled the culture that they felt had been imposed on them. It goes on. I'm not saying it's right. I understand it though. It's part of you. It didn't start a year ago. It's gone on all over. It's India changing names back to what they were.
And I worry that we're going in the wrong direction in the sense of grasping this aspect of history. I don't know if you caught this. I want to say about a month or 2 ago, there was a piece in the New York Times about the draft riots,
Right.
and it did not mention immigration at all. And again, there's a lot of ways to approach a topic like that, but one of them is to acknowledge that there were a lot of poor Irish people coming off boats at the time.
Right. Well, I have a problem with the division of American history into white and black. That there was a group of people who were white. Well, that doesn't do it. They weren't white in a lot of ways. There was so many nuances. Irish did not have the same experience as Jews. Germans did not have the same experience of Irish. And they kept their cultures for a long time. It wasn't just they came over and became white. The whole thing about the wages of whiteness. Well, a lot of times it wasn't a living wage. If you were in the Pennsylvania coal mines, and to just, and it's impoverishing American history to think it's just this division. And I don't think accusing people of everybody being oppressed advances the argument. I think you have to look at, there are nuances to this, important nuances, and there are important stories that have to be told. And if they're swept under these labels, like the guy who wrote the book, How the Irish Became White, which infuriated me. I debated him on WBAI. I said, well, there was a whole group of Irish who were white when they got here, and they were WASP, Anglo-Saxon. They were Scot-Irish. The minute they got off the boat, they were accepted because they were Protestants. And WASP is white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. Religion in the 19th century was almost as important as race.
And once we don't sort of capture the nuances of that, we kind of history kind of becomes a sort of an oppressor and oppressee, and then that's it. There's no middle ground, essentially.
One thing which you referenced before about the complexity, one of the things I learned from history, it's a complex mess.
Yeah.
The history most people get is pretty simplified, but when you dig deep, you get all these complexities and nuances. And my friend Danny Cassidy was a great Irish historian. He was right. He did a census search in New York in the 1860s. He said, how is it possible for people to live that close and live totally apart? Well, he found on Lorenz Street, which is now LaGuardia Place, there was a colony of African-American women married to Irish women. They were mostly waiters and barbers, but the Irish immigration was the only one where there were more women than men. So, sex and love conquers all.
Yes, most of the time, yeah. And I'm not even sure. I think this line is in your collection. Again, we've been talking about the Banished Children of Eve, but Looking for Jimmy takes up a lot of these issues in sort of essay or article form. And as a sort of rebut to how the Irish became white, you
Right.
point out how many Irish stayed Irish.
Right. Yeah. Well, that was what the Irish came to America to. When they came to America, they were totally disorganized. They were coming out of this trauma, and they could have faded into the population. And what they did was hold on to being Irish, that they would come in, but on their own terms. And the driving principle of Irish immigration was reorganization. The church we knew growing up was not the church when they came over. It was a lot of people had a very loose connection to the church. And it was John Hughes who started this reorganization, that the church became an instrument of discipline. Uh, Labor unions, that was a principle of reorganization. Irish formed their own unions. They hung on to jobs. They were exclusive. They didn't allow other groups in. Uh, and it was this, and that was part of the reorganization and politics, of course. Tammany was referred to as the organization. And it was there. It was before there were any social welfare things. It was the police department became Irish, fire department before civil service test. And one of the things the Irish, when they came, was security. They had lived with such insecurity for so long. They had watched this catastrophe overwhelm them, and the ambition was to feed your family. William Kennedy said about Albany Irish, he said there was only one crime, and that was to go hungry. Anything else was invisible.
Yeah.
Even organized crime, the Irish were the first gangs in New York.
No, they didn't. They came here to assimilate. What's wrong with you?
They all the institutions we associate with immigrants came out of the Irish experience.
And again, we talk about the relevance of today. You tell me what you think of this, but when I look at things like identity politics, and you look at sort of cities as these easily, you can demonize cities because they're crowded and they're this and they're that. I mean, that seems to me a real outgrowth of 19th century immigration, where cities transformed rapidly, and political organizations played to people's identity because that's where the power was.
Right. Well, the Irish recognized that because one of the geniuses of Tammany was, after the Irish were no longer the biggest part of the population, they organized the other groups. People learned politics from the Irish.
And why did they play identity politics? It's not because they were sort of, because the Irish were better than everyone else. It's because the WASPs were looking down on them in the first place.
Yeah. And they played to identity politics. There's a great part, Plunkett of Tammany Hall, which is a great book. He says, these politicians, he said, they could go into church and take their hat off and go to synagogue and put their hat on. They played to the different groups. They were playing identity politics. That's another thing that's not new in the United States. The Irish were such identified with urban political machines. When you talked about an urban political machine, you were talking about the Irish in the 19th century. And they kept their vote together, the Irish vote together, with the sense of, we have enemies out there and we identify as Irish. And that's the organizing principle of our party is. Our identity, our ethnic identity.
And again, to me, the strength of Banished Children of Eve is that it manages to capture so much of this. Now, let's be honest with people who may be thinking about reading. This is a big book, right? This is 600 or so pages we talk about.
You say it's a big book. It's like, I originally wrote it was 800 pages. And I gave a friend of mine, Bob Cranny, was a novelist. I said, "Would you read it?" He said, "No." You have to cut out 200 pages. So I cut out 200 pages, and it actually made it a better book. I felt part. There were things I had to know that the reader didn't have to know.
The question I want to ask you is, as I said earlier, this comes out in '94. It's really, the technology we associate with today really isn't around. The whole argument about attention spans and all that stuff. Where do you see things like the novel? Your book is this great, big, bustling, living novel. But it takes a certain type of reader to engage in it. Does that concern you? Are you worried about the future of the novel like that? Or is this just, once again, people just complaining about something they shouldn't really complain about?
Well, I'm too old to worry about the future. I'm not going to be around to see it. But I do know a friend of mine who teaches out in California. She assigned a book for years. She said to me, "I can't assign it anymore. it's too big.
Yeah.
Kids want to read a 600-page novel. Well, I can't change that. I can't get like the Reader's Digest version. So people will read it or they don't. But, my feeling was I was driven by this feeling that I had to get the story out. That's what I was always afraid I was going to die before, I felt this story in me. And then it was the story of the Irish immigration. It was a story of New York. I just felt it was a powerful story. And I said, if I can get it out, that'll be enough. And I
And
came up after 10 years. And then I said, well, if I don't publish it, I'm going to have a nervous breakdown. I spent 10 years on this book and it's going to wind. I see it in libraries. Only time I ever saw it by a person buying it was in the old bookstore in Grand Central Station, which was gone. And I went in and I said, I saw this woman buying. He said, that's my book. She went to put it back. She thought it was lives. And, I still get letters from people. It's very encouraging. And the characters come alive to people. I mean, they all like for a man or a writer, it's the closest you can give to giving birth.
Yeah, and I think what readers who come to this for the first time, what they're going to get is just kind of like what you said, because these events are so alive and jarring, and yet so unfamiliar.
Right.
Banished Children of Eve, to me, it brings alive in a way never before or since these sort of super important events that that people should know about.
And what I didn't want to write. I didn't want to write a novel of ideas. I wasn't want to write about this. I just wanted to write about people. I found these characters and they came alive for me. And it's a story of individual people. It's not really a story of the riots. It's a story of what happened to people during the riots. And they don't know when the riots are going to end. Nobody knew when the Civil War. One of the hardest things of historical novels is put the future out of your head. Live in the moment when the future hasn't happened and these people don't know what's going to happen. And it's a hard thing to forget about the outcome of events and just live. I wanted to be on the streets. I wanted people to know what it smells like. I wanted to know people about indoor plumbing. I spent about 6 months investigating the building the Croton Aqueduct. What that meant. Indoor toilets, people had them or they didn't. If you go to the Time Museum, they have the privies in the back next to the water supply, which was cholera. That was the people, and they hadn't put it together yet. Sanitation. It's just the unwashed masses was a literal expression. They weren't talking about. People didn't bathe. They couldn't bathe. You go into the tenements. If you wanted to cook in 100-degree heat in July, you had to put a coal stove.
In closing here, Peter, we're talking about whether or not people have time to sort of engage in things like novels, and people who do, they will get the joy out of that. But one of the things we're doing to replace that time is we're tweeting and screaming about politics all the time. Now, one of the many hats you've worn in your life was as a speechwriter for two New York State governors, Hugh Carey and Mario Cuomo, and because of all the emotions in our current political moment, as a person who spent a number of years sort of on the other side, on the inside, if you will, in state politics anyway, do you see a seismic shift? Have you seen a seismic shift in our political culture, or are we just screaming about different things, but we were screaming still the same not too long ago?
A lot of things are different. A lot of things are the same because human nature doesn't change. Circumstances change. But politics is really, it's about people. It's not about, in the end, it's not about ideas. Tip O'Neill said all politics is local. Well, I'm not sure that's true, but all politics is personal. Comes down. And the issue is, if when I was on Albany I went there in 1979, and I'll tell you this: the Me Too movement. They think things are bad then. It was like college 20 years later, and grown men. What went on then is almost unimaginable. But putting budgets together and things that hasn't really changed. I don't think that will ever change. And the process, Bismarck's famous remark about nobody should see sausage being made, that will never change. The wheeling and dealing behind the scenes. This open politics, I don't think it's ever going to happen, because if it's open, it doesn't happen. But politics, I always say, people say they hate politics. I always say, were you ever married? Marriage. Have you ever been in a family? Politics is not a dirty business. It's the business of getting things done. It's the business of human nature, and it's the business of not getting everything you want. That's the thing that scares me in politics. It's when the ideologues take over and when ideas become more important than what you can achieve, the ideology. I always think of the picture of the Reichstag with the Nazis. They did get elected, the Reichstag, and then they sat with their backs to the podium. And politics, people talking, and as long as that goes on, politics will go on. And when politics stops is really the end of the game. That's the thing after politics is totalitarianism.
Yeah,
Totalitarian states don't have politics.
Yeah, in some senses, we should be careful what we wish for, right?
Right. Yeah.
We are talking to Peter Quinn. I'm Tom Deignan for Irish American Magazine. We're about to wrap this up, Peter, but one of the reasons we're doing this on Zoom is we are still enduring this COVID nightmare. How are you and your family doing through all this?
Thank God we've done well. I got very sick in the summer, but they thought it was COVID, but they're not sure now. But the blessing of all was I'm now a grandfather. I know a young man like me. It's so out of all this panic and death, you bring it down to individuals, and you see a child, and you say, it's going to go on. It's not the end of the world. There's new life. I have great confidence in. I think the short-term future is scary, and the long-term future is good. I just think people have an instinct for survival, and in the end, this is a great country where people have learned to overcome so much, and we'll do that in the future. I don't think America's finished, and I don't think the world's finished.
And I guess in closing, as a new grandfather, as a person who just spoke a lot about how families, there is this silence about background in families. Is it something with your own children, and you might want to think about with your own grandchild? Is there a desire to instill Irishness, history? Or is that something you sort of want to make a point of doing? Do you wait and see? What are your feelings on that?
Well, when my kids were small, my wife said, "Would you stop talking about being Irish?" Because they grow up wanting to be anything. And my wife and I grew up in the Bronx. We were ethnic. We didn't think about it. I don't think about being an Irish. I was. And we raised our kids in the suburbs, and they're in a different world than we were, which is fine. That's human nature. Things don't stay the same. I'm fine with that. I think they have a sense of their Irish identity, maybe not as strong as I did. They don't go to Catholic schools. I had mostly Irish friends. They don't. And, I said, my wife and I said, we raised our children are the first Americans in the family, pure Americans. And that's good. My ancestors didn't come here to stay what they were. They wanted to be something else. And, I think intermarriage is a great thing. I hope in 100 years, every American has a Irish, Jewish, African-American, Polish ancestor. We're trying to make something here that's never been attempted in human history. A multiracial, multi-ethnic society where people aren't killing each other. That is a great exception in human history. It's rarely been tried. And, we should value that experiment instead of saying, oh, it's over and I don't want to reel any part of it. It's the dynamic of the United States, I always say, is French culture is made, English culture, German. We haven't finished. We're still in the process of making ours. And that's the greatest strength this country has.
And if you want to see one of the great moments, joyous, frightening, scary, all of the above, one of the sort of growing pains, if you will, in American history are the New York City draft riots. And Peter Quinn's novel, The Banished Children of Eve, uses that as a sort of way to take a large photo of New York and America in the 1860s. And that has just been re-released by Fordham University Press. We've been talking to Peter Quinn, novelist and historian, about that. His other books are also now available from Fordham U. Those are 3 Fenton Dunn detective novels. Highly recommend those after you're done with Banished Children of Eve, as well as a collection of his nonfiction called Looking for Jimmy. Peter Quinn, thanks so much for joining us here at Irish America.
It's good to see you. I hope to see you in person one of these days.
Someday soon. Thank you, sir.